Jerome Watson was the kind of guy who could walk into a room and disappear. Tall, lean, mid-30s, with a face that carried just enough exhaustion to make him look ordinary. If you passed him on the street, you'd probably think he was just another New Yorker. A teacher, maybe. Or some overworked office drone. Nobody ever looked twice at Jerome, and that's exactly the way he liked it. He lived in a small apartment on the Lower East Side where the rent was high, but the expectations were low. The kind of place where you could hear your neighbors arguing through the paper-thin walls. His neighbor, Mrs. Goldman, spent most evenings lecturing her cat about its dietary choices. Jerome couldn't care less. He wasn't home to make friends or small talk. His life wasn't built for that. Every morning, Jerome left his apartment with a coffee cup in one hand and a bag slung over his shoulder. He blended into the crowd, just another guy with places to be. Nobody knew that the bag he carried didn't hold a laptop or papers, but something far more important, a portable safe. Inside that safe? Let's just say it wasn't lunch money. The safe contained documents that could ruin lives, destroy careers, and topple entire systems. It was his lifeline and his insurance policy, all wrapped up in steel. Jerome wasn't a man who trusted easily. His world had taught him that trust was just another word for vulnerability. He had a friend or two, sure, but even they didn't know much about him. People thought he was just reserved, maybe a little mysterious. They had no idea that Jerome was playing a much bigger game, one where the stakes were life and death. His quiet demeanor wasn't shyness, it was strategy. His life wasn't easy, but Jerome had learned to navigate it with precision. He spent his days gathering evidence, piecing together the kind of cases that would make most people's stomachs churn. Corruption, fraud, abuse of power, he'd seen it all. But the worst part wasn't the crimes themselves, it was the people who committed them. They were the kind of men who wore expensive suits and flashed fake smiles, who thought their money and influence made them untouchable. Jerome lived to prove them wrong. Despite his careful planning and meticulous attention to detail, Jerome's life was starting to feel like a house of cards. The walls were closing in, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He'd been working on a case that was bigger than anything he'd tackled before, and it was taking its toll. The target? John Hopkins. A high-ranking police chief with a reputation for being untouchable. Hopkins wasn't just corrupt. He was dangerous. The kind of man who didn't think twice about crushing anyone who got in his way. Jerome had been gathering evidence against Hopkins for months, and he knew he was close to blowing the case wide open. But the closer he got, the more dangerous things became. His phone rang at odd hours. Strangers lingered a little too long outside his building. And then there were the little things. Locks that felt slightly off. Papers that weren't quite where he'd left them. Paranoia had become a constant companion, but Jerome knew better than to ignore it. In his line of work, paranoia wasn't just a survival skill. It was a necessity. The safe in his apartment had become more than just a storage unit. It was a symbol of everything Jerome was fighting for. Every time he opened it, he was reminded of the stakes. The documents inside weren't just pieces of paper. They were lives, futures, and justice waiting to happen. And yet Jerome couldn't shake the feeling that the safe was also a target. If anyone ever got their hands on it, everything he'd worked for would be gone. That thought haunted him as he walked into the courthouse one crisp Monday morning. The air was heavy with tension, and Jerome could feel the weight of every step. He wasn't just here as an observer. He was the reason this case had made it to trial. But as he sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, his face calm and unreadable, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Jerome sat in the back of the courtroom, his posture calm, but his senses razor-sharp. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that makes your palms sweat and your stomach churn. John Hopkins, the man at the center of this storm, strutted in like he owned the place. Dressed to the nines in a tailored suit, Hopkins exuded the kind of confidence that comes from years of getting away with murder. Not literally, but close enough. The crowd buzzed with whispers as he took his seat, flanked by his high-priced lawyer, a man who looked more like a game show host than a legal expert. Jerome kept his face neutral, but inside he was a coiled spring. Months of work had led to this moment, and while he wasn't the type to gamble, he knew all his chips were on the table. The safe, tucked neatly into his bag at his feet, was more than just a container. It was a grenade, and Hopkins was about to pull the pin without even realizing it. The trial began with the usual formalities. Prosecutors laying out their case, defense attorneys objecting to every syllable. Jerome watched Hopkins closely, noting the way he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk a permanent fixture. The man radiated smugness, a walking advertisement for unchecked power. Jerome had seen it all before, but something about Hopkins made his blood boil just a little hotter. Maybe it was the way he looked at people, like they were insects he could squash at will. During a break, Jerome stepped into the hallway, his bag slung over his shoulder. He was used to the stairs by now. People didn't recognize him, but they could sense something was different about him. It was the way he moved, the way he carried himself. He wasn't flashy, but he wasn't invisible either. He was deliberate, precise. That's when he noticed the rookie cop standing a little too close for comfort. Randy, one of Hopkins's loyal lackeys, was the type of guy who thought a badge made him bulletproof. Jerome had seen his kind before. Big talk, small brains, and a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas. Randy's eyes flicked to Jerome's bag and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "What's in the bag?" Randy asked, his tone casual, but his eyes said otherwise. Jerome didn't break stride. "Lunch," he said without missing a beat. Randy chuckled, falling into step beside him. "You always keep your lunch in a safe?" Jerome stopped, his expression flat. "Keeps the sandwiches fresh." Randy laughed, but there was no humor in it. He was testing the waters, looking for a reaction. Jerome didn't give him one. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Randy standing there, his ego bruised but his curiosity piqued. Back in the courtroom, Jerome's instincts kicked into overdrive. Something was off. He could feel it. Hopkins was too calm, his lawyer too confident. And then there was Randy, hovering near the back of the room, his eyes locked on Jerome's bag like a predator sizing up its prey. The moment came faster than Jerome expected. 1 minute, the courtroom was focused on a witness testimony, and the next, Randy was at Jerome's feet snatching the bag. The room froze as Randy held up the safe for everyone to see, his grin wide and full of arrogance. "What's so special about this, huh?" Randy said, his voice loud enough to draw every eye in the room. "What's the big secret?" Jerome stood slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Put it down." Randy ignored him, his grin widening. "What's the matter? Afraid we'll find something you don't want us to see?" Jerome took a step forward. "I'm not afraid of anything, but you're about to be." The room was dead silent as Randy grabbed a crowbar from a nearby table and jammed it into the edge of the safe. The lock gave way with a loud crack, and in an instant, a jet of neon green liquid shot out, drenching Randy from head to toe. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Shouts, gasps, and in some cases, poorly stifled laughter. Randy staggered back, wiping furiously at his face as the paint dripped down his uniform. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. Jerome crossed his arms, a smirk finally breaking through his stoic exterior. "That, my friend, is what happens when you stick your nose where it doesn't belong." The courtroom was a mix of hysteria and disbelief. Hopkins' smug composure faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Jerome. But Jerome didn't flinch. He'd just sent a message loud and clear. This wasn't a game, and he wasn't someone to mess with. The courtroom was a chaotic mess. Randy, drenched in neon green paint, looked like a bad science experiment gone wrong. His uniform was ruined, his face a mix of fury and humiliation, and the rest of the room, it was pure pandemonium. People whispered, some openly laughed, and the judge's gavel pounded like a hammer trying to hold back an avalanche, but no one could ignore the scene that had just unfolded. Jerome stood perfectly still, arms crossed, watching as Randy stumbled back to his seat, dripping paint all over the pristine courtroom floor. The rookie cop was wiping furiously at his face, his once smug demeanor completely shattered. Jerome didn't move, didn't flinch. His calm expression was the equivalent of pouring salt into an open wound, and Randy knew it. The judge finally managed to restore order, her sharp voice slicing through the chaos. "Officer, explain yourself," she snapped, her tone leaving no room for excuses. Randy hesitated, glancing over at Hopkins, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. I was just securing potential evidence," Randy stammered, his voice shaky. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Securing evidence by breaking into private property? Do you have a warrant, officer?" Randy's silence was deafening. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the judge continued, her voice colder now. "You've overstepped your bounds, officer. This court will not tolerate reckless behavior, especially during such a high-profile case. Return to your seat and remain silent." Randy slumped into his chair, his green-streaked face a portrait of defeat. Hopkins leaned over and whispered something sharp and cutting into his ear, but Jerome didn't bother to try to decipher it. His focus was on the growing tension in the room and the way every eye seemed to gravitate toward him. The prosecutor, Patricia Hayes, was the first to speak after the judge's reprimand. "Mr. Watson," she began, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "Would you care to explain what just happened?" Jerome's response was cool and measured. "Simple. Some people don't know how to keep their hands to themselves. That safe is my personal property, and I take its security very seriously." Patricia nodded, clearly holding back a follow-up question. But the defense attorney wasn't as restrained. He stood, his smirk plastered across his face like he'd just been handed a golden opportunity. Your Honor, I believe this raises serious concerns about Mr. Watson's credibility. What kind of man brings a booby-trapped safe into a courtroom? It calls into question the legitimacy of his involvement in this case. Jerome finally moved, leaning forward in his chair. His voice cut through the room like a blade. What kind of man? The kind who knows people like you will do anything to twist the truth. That's what kind of man. The room buzzed with murmurs again, but the judge silenced them with a sharp glare. Enough, she said firmly. We will address this incident later. For now, the trial will continue. But Jerome could feel the shift in the air. The safe had become a focal point, and while the defense attorney tried to cast doubt, Jerome knew the truth was slowly pulling the rug out from under them. He sat back, his face calm, but his mind racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courtroom was quiet now, the kind of eerie silence that follows a storm. But the tension? It was suffocating. Every eye in the room kept darting back to Jerome, their curiosity practically buzzing in the air. Randy sat slumped in his seat, still streaked with patches of green paint, his dignity smeared as badly as his uniform. Hopkins, however, sat unnervingly still, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning holes into Jerome's face. Jerome knew this look. It wasn't confusion. It was calculation. The trial resumed, but the energy in the room had shifted. The prosecution presented more evidence, but Jerome could tell no one was paying attention. Everyone was stuck on the same question. What the hell was in that safe? He could almost hear their thoughts racing, the questions stacking up. Was it evidence? Was it a trick? Was it something bigger? Jerome sat motionless, his face unreadable. The defense attorney, emboldened by the earlier chaos, stood and made his move. Your Honor, he began, his voice oozing fake politeness, given the unusual circumstances, I request that Mr. Watson's safe be opened and its contents examined, for the sake of transparency, of course. Jerome leaned forward, his voice cutting like a blade. You mean for the sake of a desperate fishing expedition? You want transparency? Fine. But you're not going to like what you find. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but wary. Mr. Watson, do you object to revealing the contents of the safe? Jerome paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then he spoke. No, Your Honor. I have nothing to hide, but I'll warn you, this isn't going to end the way they think it will. A murmur rippled through the room as the bailiff was called over to bring the safe forward. The metal box, still faintly sticky with green paint, sat on the evidence table like a bomb waiting to go off. Jerome watched as the judge gave the order to open it. The tension in the room was a living, breathing thing now. Everyone holding their breath as the bailiff cracked the safe open. What spilled out wasn't just evidence, it was an avalanche. Documents, photographs, recordings, all meticulously organized and damning beyond belief. Every single piece pointed straight at John Hopkins. Bribes, blackmail, falsified reports. It was a detailed roadmap of his corruption, tied up with a neat little bow. The courtroom erupted into chaos once again, gasps and shouts filling the air. Hopkins's face turned from stone to ash. He lunged forward, slamming his hands on the table. This is bullshit, he bellowed, his voice cracking under the weight of his fury. This is a setup. Jerome stayed seated, his expression calm, but his voice carried a weight that silenced the room. Set up? That's funny coming from you, Hopkins. I've spent months digging through the wreckage you've left behind, the lives you've destroyed, the families you've torn apart. And you thought you could keep hiding behind your badge? Not anymore. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order, but the courtroom was electric. The defense attorney scrambled to regain control, stammering objections that fell flat. Meanwhile, Patricia Hayes rose from her seat, her face a mixture of shock and determination. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. This evidence changes everything. I request an immediate review of these documents and a suspension of all current proceedings until we've verified their authenticity. Hopkins exploded again, shouting about conspiracies and vendettas, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Jerome had lit the fuse, and now the entire system was about to implode. As the bailiff began gathering the evidence, Jerome stood. He adjusted his tie, glanced around the room, and finally spoke. You wanted to know what was in the safe. Now you know. But don't mistake this for the end of the story. This is just the beginning. With that, he walked out, leaving behind a courtroom in chaos and a reputation that would haunt Hopkins and his cronies for the rest of their lives.